G7 leaders meet in Italy to finalize a new plan to help Ukraine in its fight against Russia. It's a $50 billion deal using Russian assets to fund the defense of Ukraine. Just ahead, Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly will be live in studio.
Today is a truly historic day.
To make sure you have the tools to continue to defend not just your country, but all of our democracies.
Put that money to work for Ukraine. Another reminder to Putin, we're not backing down.
We're joined now by Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly, who is live in the studio. Minister, good to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Hi, David. It's a pleasure.
Let's start with that $50 billion loan to Ukraine. This is using the interest from frozen Russian assets. There has been hesitation to do that in the past because of fear of retaliation against Canadian assets and other assets abroad, or other countries pulling their assets out of Western banks out of concern. Are you worried about retaliation from this move?
I think the message we're sending is very clear, and the message G7 leaders are sending is very clear. Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia needs to pay, period. And so I think it's an important decision that was taken, and it is something that Canada has been very much more forward-leaning recently on this.
But there has been this concern, as we spoke to diplomats from other countries leading up to the G7, that developing economies in particular might be worried that their assets could be seized if they were in, let's say, a European bank or in a Canadian bank, and that this could start a precedent. Are you saying it's the specifics of what Russia has done that makes this unique rather than a precedent?
This is something that lots of finance ministers have been working on. This is something also that many leaders have been working on. I think we were able to find a way through the use of collateral and interests. But at the same time, fundamentally, for those who are watching us right now, it is a message that, of course, from the moment that Russia decided to invade Ukraine, there was a cost to that. And war has broken to Europe. We know that Putin has no red line, David. After Ukraine, it's NATO territory. So what Ukrainians are doing right now, they're fighting for their freedom, they're fighting also for our own freedom. So by sending that message and using sovereign Russian assets as a way to make sure that Russia is accountable economically for the war is extremely important. Putin has no red line. I've said that recently. And I think we should not we should not show our own red lines. We should be clear in sending a strong message and putting a lot of pressure.
So why not seize the assets entirely? Right now, you're just taking the interest. You know, they're sitting there, the central bank assets in an account, accruing interest on whatever, and you're taking that. Why not just take them entirely and turn them over to the people of Ukraine?
I think that's a conversation that many G7 leaders had, many finance ministers had. Meanwhile, on the geopolitical, on my side, it was important also to work with foreign minister to be supporting this approach.
Is this basically just as far as the G7 countries were willing to go at this point? Because it has gone rather incrementally in terms of military aid. Is this as far as you would go on the financial side?
Canadians have put more than $8 billion of taxpayers' money to support Ukrainians. We are now $50 billion in Europe, $50 billion also in the US. This war has cost lots of people in the West a lot of money. Why? Because it's fundamental to our security. This was not our own decision to invade Ukraine. This was not the West's decision, Canada, US, Europeans' decision to break the UN Charter. It was Russia's. And so in these circumstances, there's a cost to this war, and Russians need to be paying for it.
The financial aid is one thing. Military aid, of course, is another. And the first of 4 Canadian armored vehicles will soon head to Ukraine. But I'm sure you probably heard the comments today from NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg, who said that delays in sending military support have created big problems for Ukrainians on the battlefield. He's speaking about all NATO countries, including Canada. What do you say to those criticisms?
Well, I think he's right. I think that indeed we need to be faster. Indeed, Ukraine needs weapons now. They need air defense systems now. And so that's why we've been working on this. There is the Czech Republic initiative, and there will be also equipment from Canada being set through this initiative very soon to Ukraine. So more news on that very shortly.
This is buying the ammunition. The Czech Republic is looking for howitzer shells and things like this.
We are also working and participating to the German initiative on air defense. We bought an air defense system from the US. We bought that months ago, and we have been working very hard with the U.S. to deliver it because it's still in production. So we know that production lines have not been delivering as fast as we need to. And that's why we need to be able not only to send ammunitions and send air defense and all military equipment really, really quickly, but also we need to make sure that that's done and that we're in a good position for the NATO meeting that is happening in a month in Washington, where of course we will be sending a clear message on our support to Ukraine.
Okay, 'cause that's kind of where I wanted to go next. So as we heard what Stoltenberg said today,
Yep.
and you talked about the supply lines aren't delivering fast enough. Some of that is because we haven't built up that domestic industrial capacity in Western countries, and thus the shortfall. You've seen major business groups say this week that if Canada doesn't have a clear commitment to 2%, the country will be diplomatically isolated. And you shared a stage this week with Senator Chris Coons, who is known as President Biden's foreign policy whisperer.
And a good friend of mine.
Well, but he also said, he would be reassured more as a good friend if there was a clear path to 2%. So you mentioned the NATO Leader Summit in Washington in July. Will Canada go there with a clear plan to 2%?
I'm convinced. I think we came up with a good defense policy update, and the Minister of Defense did a really good job by bringing us to 1.76%. In that defense policy update, we're really focusing on the Arctic. And I can answer also questions on the Arctic if you want to, because this is a really big focus of our government's foreign policy work right now and defense policy work. And at the same time, there is still lots of military procurements, including submarines, that need to be announced. And I'm convinced that based on that, we can be on a path towards 2%.
But by July, because I know the submarines are kind of aspirational right now, and that it's something Canada says it intends to do, but it hasn't done, so you can't bake it into the calculations on how much of the GDP is spent to 2%. But
David,
will we see that in July?
I'm convinced we'll be in a good place in July. And I know that it's important for Canadians for us to meet that target. It's important for a bilateral relationship with the U.S. It's important for our relationship also with NATO allies. And I think Canadians know that for a long time, we were blessed by our geography. We were protected by our geography, but the world has changed. And now we need to invest more in defense. And I think Canadians agree, and that's what we have done recently also, and that's what we'll continue to do.
But I don't want to overstate or misinterpret what I'm hearing from you. It sounds to me like by July, Canada will have a plan for 2%. Am I understanding that right? Am I overstating
I'm
that?
convinced that the Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, and I will be able to send a clear message to NATO allies by July.
Okay, you mentioned the Arctic, so I just want to quickly just talk about the Arctic strategy you're coming up with. You're working with Sweden and Finland on this. Will this be part of what we might see in July? Extra military equipment purchased for patrolling
So I'm
the
working on an Arctic foreign policy.
Right.
So you know, there was also already an Arctic framework that was co-developed by Indigenous people with the government in 2019. But the international part of the strategy is now moot. Why? Because we know that first, Russia invaded Ukraine, and that created a lot of instability geopolitically. We know that Russia is our neighbor to the north. And at the same time, meanwhile, we've been able to settle a very important diplomatic dispute, which we call the Whiskey War with Denmark on Hans Island, and also Sweden and Finland, which are also Arctic countries, have joined NATO. So now 7 of the 8 Arctic nations are now part of NATO, the 8th one being Russia. So we want to be closer to them on cooperation, of course, on things like climate, trade, etc., but also, of course, on security and on military cooperation. So that's why I'm working on this, and it's to follow up the work that Bill Blair, the Minister of Defense, has been also doing through the DPU, the Defense Policy Update, where for the first time, Canada put really a lot of emphasis on the fact that as a country, we needed to invest in our own defense. And the fact that we know that climate change is having an impact on maritime route in the north. We know that Russia being a neighbor, our security is much more at stake. And that's why we indeed need to get to 2%, but we fundamentally need to invest in our own collective defense.
Okay, a lot of this is being driven by Russia. I mean, obviously China as well, but Russia it would be the primary player as one of the 8 Arctic nations.
Yep.
There is this strange thing happening in Cuba, Minister, that I'm wondering if you can help me understand. The HMCS Margaret Brooke, which is a patrol vessel from Canada, gone to Havana for 3 days starting tomorrow to celebrate Canada-Cuba bilateral relations. And there's some eyebrows being raised because it's in port at the same time that Russian military vessels, including nuclear-powered submarines, are there. Why would Canada have a Canadian ship in a Cuban port at the same time as Russian military vessels are there?
Listen, this is something that I have to look much more closer to. This is an information that is news to me because the Minister of Defense also works with CAF and DND on this very issue. But of course, we'll look into this and get back.
Okay. All right. I want to switch, if I can, to the Middle East and the situation in Israel, between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. President Biden has said he does not expect to see a ceasefire soon, which is something you've been pushing for. Antony Blinken says Hamas has suggested some unworkable changes to the proposal that's been put on the table. Hamas wants Israeli guarantees on ending the war. Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel will not end the war until Hamas is destroyed. How do you get to compromise with those intractable positions?
Well, first and foremost, our position here at home has been clear, is we need the violence to stop. We've been calling for a ceasefire now for 6 months. We've been saying that hostages must be released. We've been saying also that 2 women and children have died and civilians must be protected. And we've been saying that humanitarian aid needs to get into Gaza. We need this proposal to be approved by the Netanyahu government and also by Hamas, which we don't talk to because they're a terrorist organization. So we're in contact, and I'm personally in contact with Qatar and many Arab countries, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, to make sure that they put pressure on Hamas and we put pressure on Israel. But I think it's fundamental that we bring back peace to the Middle East, and that will also help here social cohesion, because we know that there's a rise of anti-Semitism. We know that the Jewish community is scared, and it's a real big issue. We know also that there's been acts of Islamophobia, and we saw it again recently, also in Ontario. So the war needs to end, and we need to be able to talk about the day after and what can we do to bring back peace to the region.
Obviously, you don't talk to Hamas, a designated terrorist organization in this country and many other countries, but you do talk to Israel. And the government there is changing. Benny Gantz, seen as a moderate, he resigned from the Netanyahu war cabinet. Now he's relying, Benjamin Netanyahu is, on ultra-nationalist political parties, right? His finance minister and his national security minister, they threatened to quit over the ceasefire proposal when President Biden laid it out. Can you get a ceasefire with the Israeli government structured this way politically?
Listen, we don't see eye to eye with the Netanyahu government. This is no news. I've had many conversations also with the foreign minister, with also Ron Dermer, a key minister close to Netanyahu. And we're sending these clear messages of, first, they need to accept, they need to approve the deal. And second, this is about the long-term security of Israel. And so we're very concerned by the direction the Netanyahu government is taking. We need to empower the voices of people in Israel and also within the Jewish community here at home and around the world that are willing to take a chance on peace. But I understand that there must be conditions to that peace, including the fact that hostages need to get back. And second, that the creation of a Palestinian state, which we believe in, needs to be a way that it's not threatful to Israelis themselves. Israelis and Palestinians need to be able to live side by side in peace. And I fundamentally believe also that we need to work on an irreversible path towards the creation of a Palestinian state, because it's been too long for that state to be actually to be created. It's been too long. The negotiations are going nowhere, and we know that the Netanyahu government is fundamentally against a two-state solution, and that is a real problem.
So recently at the United Nations, Canada changed its posture on the two-state vote, and you signaled that you would recognize a Palestinian state before the peace process is complete.
Yep.
When you look at what's happening right now there, it doesn't sound like the peace process is going to come to fruition anytime soon. So what does all of this mean for the timeline of Canada recognizing an independent Palestinian state?
So just to go back on your question, indeed we changed our position because for a long time Canada had the position that we would indeed, like you said, we would recognize a Palestinian state at the time where in the end the parties would agree.
Right.
But we know that the Netanyahu government, like I just mentioned, is against it. And we know that Hamas is in control of hostages and of Gaza. And so we said that we will recognize the creation of a Palestinian state at the right time. And you may say, okay, what does the right time mean? Well, we believe that first we need a ceasefire. And while we're pushing for the ceasefire, David, I'm already in conversations about the day after. We already talked to all the Arab countries and the G7 of what can be that day after. How can we reinforce the Palestinian Authority to make sure that Hamas is no longer in control of Gaza?
Is that who it needs to be? Does it need to be the Palestinian Authority, or can it be something else?
That's clearly the plan. We need to make sure that we reinforce the Palestinian Authority. And that's why I'm having a phone call with the Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority tomorrow, Prime Minister Mustafa. We need to make sure that they are a competent, technocratic government. That's the idea. Palestinians need to be able to have basic services. We need to make sure that there's no extremist settlers violence also in the West Bank, because we know that there's been an increase of violence there. But at the same time, we need a plan for the day after in Gaza. And the plan has always been that the Palestinian Authority would be there to provide services and support. That's what we believe in. That being said, the first step to that is the Biden proposal. Mm-hmm. And that's why we need to make sure to put pressure through our different contacts on both parties.
So while we wait to see where that process goes and the negotiation goes, the fighting continues.
Yeah.
And we saw two separate reports, from the United Nations this week, concluding Hamas had committed war crimes on October 7th, but also that Israel had committed war crimes in its response from October 7th to the end of December. We had Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières on the show last night, and they say they do not take Israel at its word, that it is taking precautions to minimize civilian casualties in compliance with international law. How do you view these findings and these statements this week?
Well, I think they're important. And that's why we've been clear in terms of children. Too many children and women have been killed. Too many, innocent civilians have been killed. When you look at our foreign policy, there are three principles that have been guiding what our position on the Middle East and this conflict. First one is, of course, Israel's right to exist and to defend itself according to international law, first. Second, of course, if you're following international law, you need to protect civilians. So the protection of civilians is at the core of Canada's foreign policy and has been since even the 90s with Lord Axworthy, making sure that we were talking about landmines and also child soldiers.
Do you think it's being followed in Israel?
I'll just
Sorry,
finish.
go ahead.
The third principle is also the fact that we believe in a two-state solution and the creation of a Palestinian state at the right time. So these principles are in tension. They are. That's why this conflict is so complicated and difficult. I've never seen a geopolitical issue, I must say, a political issue more difficult than the Middle East. But I think that those who are not respecting these principles need to be held accountable.
But do you agree with the UN conclusions that Israel has broken laws of war?
I think that there will be definitely prosecution for that, maybe in Israel, maybe at the international level. And Canada will follow what is happening and will take a decision in due course. Meanwhile, doesn't mean that we're not extremely preoccupied. Doesn't mean that we stopped sending arms to Israel back in January. So, because we sent a message, although we're a close friend to Israel, and we're a close friend to the Palestinian people as well.
I have one last question for you before we leave, and it's on the domestic issue of foreign interference in Canadian elections. Jagmeet Singh has read the NSI COP report. Elizabeth May has read the NSI COP report. Elizabeth May said she was relieved when she read it, that no one in the current parliament could be described as a traitor. Jagmeet Singh gave a less clear explanation today, but certainly said he was alarmed by what he saw and that there were MPs in the past, we don't know if they're still current, who have been traitors to Canadian democracy. I don't know if you've read the NSI report or not. How confident are you on what you know about the situation of the integrity of every member of Parliament that sits in the House of Commons right now?
First and foremost, the question of foreign interference is extremely important. And it's a good thing that, although it's making news every day, it's important that we shine light on the issue. Why? Because all democracies around the world, they're going through this. And it's happening on the question of foreign interference, but also it's happening on the question of disinformation online. And that's also a main issue. What I could tell you also is we're the only country doing a public inquiry on this. Lots of G7 countries are looking at us thinking, oh, that's interesting. Okay, so how can we learn from this? So we need to be in solution mode. To be in solution mode, all key leaders of parties need to take the briefing and need to have access to the report. And the fact that the leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre, is not taking the briefing is a problem, because it should not be a partisan issue. We should not be reading in the news every day, oh, some people are problematic, some are not. Fundamentally, can we just agree on facts? And can we be in solution mode? Why? Because the people watching us at home right now need to be confident that democracy is working in our country.
I completely agree, but the way this is being done, with the public release of a redacted report, a partial explanation from one politician who has read it but can't say everything, and then a slightly different explanation from another politician, there is an incoherence in the way this is being communicated to us because of the way national security is dealt with in the country. And part of, I guess, having confidence that it can be dealt with is having confidence that the Parliament is pristine. Are you confident it is?
Of course it is. Of course it is. And that's what makes Canadian society what it is. The fact that we're a safe country, that we are a prosperous country, and that's a country where all of us can trust each other. That's at the core of democracy. And that we elect the representatives that basically work for us, not only for them. Now, on my side, as foreign minister, if I see diplomats that are not basically staying in their lane and undergoing foreign interference, I'll send them packing. That's what I did recently, a year ago, with the Chinese consul in Toronto. And so that's my job. My job is to make sure to take diplomatic actions if I see things that are fundamentally against First Canada's national interests, against the Convention on the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, and at the same time also that would endanger people at home. So it is really important. It's unfortunate that we're seeing a lot of different affirmations linked to that, but fundamentally, I think it's important that the Conservatives not make it a partisan issue, because what Pierre Poilievre is saying basically is if there's anybody in his own caucus that is undergoing foreign interference, he's not willing to shine light on the issue and to take action against it. And that's a problem.
Okay. Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly, we're out of time. Thank you so much for coming.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.